I never thought I'd be the kind of person to sleep in a graveyard. It wasn't something I had planned, and it wasn't for the thrill of it either. It just happened. I was in my late 30s at the time, going through a rough patch in life. Work was draining, my personal life was nothing to talk about, and I was tired of everything. I wanted a break from the noise, from the stress, from people. So I packed up my gear, stuffed a tent into my old hiking bag, and decided to go somewhere quiet. I wasn't looking for adventure, just isolation. Somewhere away from the roads, away from the campsites where people would gather with their families, cooking meals over their campfires and laughing. I didn't want to hear laughter. I wanted silence. I found a spot on an old map, just a patch of green far from any town. It didn't have a name, just a few markings indicating some kind of historical site. I figured it would be an old abandoned ruin, maybe a forgotten farmstead, something with a bit of history but nothing too interesting. It was far enough from the main roads that I doubted anyone would be around, and that's exactly what I wanted. I parked my car a few miles away and hiked in, my pack feeling heavier with every step. The landscape was rugged, overgrown, untouched. No trails, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, probably just small animals. I liked it. It was peaceful. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was starting to set. The air was cooling, and the wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the trees. That's when I saw the headstones. At first, I thought they were just rocks, maybe old boundary markers. But as I got closer, I realized what they were. Weathered, leaning gravestones, some half sunk into the earth. The inscriptions were barely legible, worn away by time. There was no fence, no sign, nothing to indicate this was a graveyard. Just the stones, scattered haphazardly. Some so eroded they looked like jagged teeth poking out of the dirt. I stood there for a while, debating. I could turn back, find another spot. But I had already hiked miles, and the thought of retracing my steps in the dark didn't sit well with me. The place didn't feel eerie, just forgotten. It had been a long time since anyone cared about this patch of land. The dead didn't care where I slept, so I set up my tent right there, on the edge of the graves, making sure to avoid stepping on them as much as possible. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt like no one would mind. The ground was uneven, filled with roots and stones, but I managed to find a spot that was flat enough to be comfortable. By the time I had everything set up, night had fully settled in. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. The wind had picked up even more, carrying a chill that seeped into my clothes. I had planned to make a fire, but I decided against it. There was something about the silence of the place that made me want to leave it undisturbed. I sat there for a while, eating a cold meal from my pack, listening to the wind. The only other sound was the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling in the trees. It was peaceful in a way, but not comforting. There was no warmth to it, no sense of safety, just quiet. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay there, staring at the fabric above me. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was hard, and the wind made the tent fabric ripple like something was moving outside. I kept telling myself it was just the weather, just the trees swaying. Somewhere in the night, I heard footsteps. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a fox, but these weren't the light, skittering steps of a small creature. They were deliberate, heavy, slow, like someone walking barefoot on the uneven ground. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, closer. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight, waiting. But then the footsteps stopped completely. The wind kept blowing. The trees kept rustling, but nothing else. No crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs, just stillness. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, it was still dark. The air inside the tent was cold, and the fabric was damp with condensation. I checked my watch. It was just after 3 in the morning. My body was stiff from the hard ground, but something else had woken me. There was no wind anymore. No rustling, no movement, just dead silence. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. They were closer this time, right outside the tent. Slow, steady. A few steps, then a pause, then another. I gripped my flashlight again, my heart pounding. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. The footsteps circled the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt, the shifting of grass. They stopped just behind my tent, where I couldn't see. I barely breathed, my hands sweating around the flashlight. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything. Breathing, movement, anything. But there was nothing, just silence. Then something pressed against the fabric of my tent. Not hard, just enough to make an imprint. Like a hand, fingers splayed out. I snapped on the flashlight, aiming it at the spot. But by the time the beam hit, the pressure was gone. The fabric was smooth again, undisturbed. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first hints of light crept through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and everything looked normal. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't bother eating, didn't take my time. I just wanted to get away from that place. As I turned to leave, I noticed something. One of the gravestones, the one closest to my tent, had been cleaned. The dirt that had once covered the inscription was gone. The letters clear. It was a name I didn't recognize, but the date stood out. The death date was exactly 100 years ago to the day. I didn't stay to think about it. I hiked back to my car without stopping, without looking back. I don't camp alone anymore. It was late autumn when I decided to go camping alone in the woods outside a small town in Montana. The trees were half bare, their skeletal branches reaching up into a sky that had been gray all day. The air was cold but not freezing, just enough to make my breath visible in the fading light. The forecast had said there might be rain, but I had packed accordingly. I didn't mind roughing it. I had been on solo trips before. Something about the quiet of nature pulled me back every time, no matter how much the world changed. The area I had chosen was remote, about a 3-hour drive from my house. I had been here before, years ago, but it had been summer then. Now, with the season shifting into winter, the place felt different. The trails were empty, and I had seen only 2 other cars parked near the entrance to the forest. I assumed hunters or hikers. I had driven another 20 minutes down a narrow dirt road before pulling off into a clearing. There were no signs of anyone else camping nearby. Just trees, the smell of damp earth, and the occasional rustling of dry leaves carried by the wind. I set up my tent near a fallen tree, positioned so I could use it as a windbreak. After gathering some wood for a fire, I got it going and settled in for the night. I had brought some food, nothing fancy, just the usual campfire meal. As I sat there eating, watching the flames flicker, I felt at ease. It had been a long week at work, and I needed this escape. By the time the sun fully disappeared, the woods around me became pitch dark. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. Probably deer, maybe a fox. I wasn't worried. Out here, the biggest threat was usually the weather or a poorly planned route. I had just started to douse the fire when I saw something. A figure in the distance, barely visible between the trees. It was hard to tell at first, but as I focused, I could make out the silhouette of a man. He was standing just far enough away that I couldn't see any details, only that he was watching. At first, I assumed it was another camper or a hunter, maybe someone who had spotted my fire and was curious. But he didn't move. He didn't call out or make his presence known. He just stood there, still, as if he was waiting for something. I felt uneasy but tried to brush it off. I wasn't trespassing, and I had every right to be here. Still, something about the way he stood there made my skin crawl. I turned back toward my tent, pretending not to care, and continued putting out the fire. When I glanced back again, he was gone. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me twitch. I kept my knife close, even knowing it was probably nothing. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, never left me. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to stay another night. I had planned for a 2-day trip, and I wasn't going to let one strange encounter ruin it. I spent most of the day hiking, exploring areas I hadn't seen in years. The landscape was beautiful, even in the cold. At times, I almost forgot about the man in the woods. Almost. It was when I returned to camp that I noticed something was wrong. My tent had been moved. Not much, just a few inches, but enough for me to know it wasn't the wind. My gear had been shuffled around. My bag was open, though nothing seemed to be missing. The firewood I had left stacked was knocked over. Someone had been here. My gut told me it was the man from last night. Maybe he had come closer while I was gone, checked my camp, looking for something. But why? He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't left any clear signs of aggression. Just an intrusion, a quiet violation of my space. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to be chased out. I had a rifle in my truck and my knife with me. If someone was messing with me, I could handle it. That night, I built my fire higher. I wanted to make sure I could see in all directions. If he came back, I wanted to know. The forest around me was silent, unnervingly so. Even the usual rustling of animals seemed distant. I sat there for hours, staring into the trees, waiting. Then I saw him again, closer this time. He stepped out of the trees slowly, like he wanted me to see him. The firelight flickered against his face, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. His clothes were dark, simple. His face was lean, almost gaunt. But his eyes were what unsettled me the most. There was something calculated about them. He was watching me, but not in a way that felt random. Not like a lost hiker or someone just curious. It was intentional. I didn't move. I wanted to see what he would do. For a long time, he just stood there. Then, without a sound, he took a step back and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Light footsteps, a branch moving, but I couldn't be sure. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. My body was tense, waiting for him to show up again. But he didn't. Not while I packed. Not while I loaded my truck. It wasn't until I started driving that I saw him again. He was standing just off the road, watching me go. This time, though, he wasn't alone. There were two of them. The second man was older, with a rigid posture. Even from a distance, something about him seemed military. The way he stood, the way he scanned the area. He wasn't just some random person. And then I understood. The man who had been watching me, he wasn't just anyone. He was a soldier who had been out here for a reason. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight out of that forest and didn't look back. Later, when I checked the local news, I found a story. A body had been discovered in the woods not far from where I had camped. The victim was an off-duty soldier, missing for days. The details were sparse, but one thing was clear. He had been murdered. And the man I had seen, he wasn't just some drifter. He was the killer, and I had almost been next. I've always liked camping. It gives me a break from the noise of everyday life. No emails, no calls, no stress. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. But ever since my last trip, I haven't gone back. I don't think I ever will. It was late September, just cool enough that the air felt crisp but not so cold that I'd be uncomfortable at night. I chose a quiet spot in a forest up north, a few hours' drive from home. I'd been there before, deep enough that I wouldn't see other campers, but not too far that I couldn't hike back to my truck if needed. I arrived in the afternoon and set up my tent on a small clearing near a stream. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was quiet except for the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, probably squirrels or birds. I spent the evening collecting wood, setting up my fire, and cooking a simple meal over the flames. Everything was peaceful. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned dark, I noticed something odd. There was a smell in the air, faint but noticeable. It was a damp, rotten smell, like old wood left to decay in the rain. I figured it was from the nearby stream, maybe some dead fish or rotting vegetation. It didn't bother me much at first, but it lingered longer than it should have. I stayed by the fire for a while, enjoying the warmth. When it got late, I decided to turn in. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the occasional crack of the fire outside. The forest was still and quiet, except for the distant call of an owl. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had snapped a branch outside. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was heavier, like a footstep. I held my breath, listening. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. Then another crack, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, trying to keep my breathing steady. I listened hard, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was just a deer. I'd seen plenty of them on past trips. Still, something felt off. I sat up, unzipped the tent just a little, and shined my flashlight outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The trees beyond the clearing stood tall and dark, barely moving in the still air. And then I saw her. A woman stood just beyond the reach of my flashlight, partially hidden by the trees. Her clothes were dark and loose, hanging off her thin frame. Her face was pale, but I couldn't make out her features clearly. She wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out to ask if she needed help, but something in the way she stood, still and silent, made my throat tighten. Then, slowly, she took a step back, disappearing into the darkness. I waited, straining to hear any sound of her leaving, but there was nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, barely moving, listening to the forest. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I wasn't about to start hiking in the dark. So I waited. By morning, I convinced myself that maybe she was just some lost hiker. A strange one, sure, but harmless. Maybe she hadn't even seen me. Maybe she'd just been passing through. Still, I decided I'd had enough of camping for one trip. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack. As I took down my tent, I noticed something on the ground near my campsite. Bare footprints. They led from the tree line to where she had stood. But what disturbed me the most was that there were no footprints leading away. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my pack, stomped out my fire, and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I haven't been camping since. I never thought much about camping alone. I had done it before. Set up my tent, started a fire, cooked my own food, and spent the night listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful in a way that few things in life were. But peace can turn into something else in the blink of an eye. This happened in 2019. I was 32 at the time, and I had a habit of heading out into the wilderness whenever life started to feel too crowded. That summer had been especially draining. So I packed up my truck and drove a few hours north of the city to a place I had been once before, deep in a national forest. The spot I picked was remote, far from any major trails or campgrounds. The closest town was at least an hour's drive away, and I doubted many people came through there. That was the appeal. I wanted silence, space, and the kind of night where the only light came from the stars and my fire. I arrived in the early evening, later than I had planned. The drive had taken longer because some of the dirt roads were washed out from recent rain, and I had to be careful not to get my truck stuck in deep mud. By the time I found a good clearing and parked, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees. I set up quickly. My tent was a simple one, a one-person setup that didn't take long to pitch. I got a fire going and cooked some food, enjoying the quiet as the forest darkened around me. It was the kind of darkness you only get when you're far from cities, thick, absolute, with shadows that seem deeper than they should be. The first few hours were exactly what I had hoped for. The fire crackled, the night air was cool but not too cold, and the sky was full of stars. I sat back in my camping chair, stretched out my legs, and let myself relax. That changed when I heard the first noise. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I glanced up from the fire, listening. The forest had its own sounds at night, and I had spent enough time outdoors to know what was normal. This didn't feel normal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Something moving through the underbrush. I went back to my fire, but my body had already shifted into alertness. The next sound was closer. Another snap, followed by a rustling. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only reached so far before getting swallowed by darkness. I didn't see anything. I told myself again that it was just an animal. Maybe a large one, maybe not. Either way, I wasn't going to let it ruin my night. I tried to shake it off. The next hour was quiet. Too quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't realize how tense I was until I stood up to stretch and felt how stiff my back had become. I shook it off and threw another log onto the fire, hoping the extra light would make me feel better. That's when I saw the footprint. It was just past the fire's glow, pressed into the soft dirt near the trees. It was a boot print, too large to be mine. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I left that there earlier without realizing it? Had someone been out here before me? I stood there for a long time, staring at that print, waiting for some logical explanation to come to me. But there wasn't one. The night was still. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness, feeling more exposed than I ever had before. Then I heard breathing, not my own. Low, steady, coming from the trees. I didn't move. I didn't blink. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't see anything, but I knew. Asterisk, asterisk, someone was there, watching, waiting. Asterisk, asterisk. I took a step back toward my tent, my mind racing. I had my truck. I could leave. But if someone was out there, had they tampered with it? Had they flattened a tire? Blocked the path? I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, my hand shaking. Nothing. The sound had stopped, but I knew what I had heard. I turned, walked quickly to my truck, and checked the tires. They were fine, but I still didn't feel right. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to spend the night. I packed up as quickly as I could, shoving everything into the truck bed without bothering to do it neatly. Every few seconds, I stopped to listen. I didn't hear anything, but I felt something. Presence. A weight in the air. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound shattered the silence, and for a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. I didn't stay to find out. I threw it into reverse, turned around, and took off down the dirt road. My headlights carved a path through the darkness, and I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was well past the forest's edge, until I saw the first hints of civilization again. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I never went back to that spot. I still love camping. I still go out into the wilderness, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never ignore the feeling that I'm being watched. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Appalachian woods. I had done solo trips before, but always in places where trails were well marked and campsites were at least somewhat within reach of other people. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to push myself, go somewhere remote, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I planned for everything. My pack was loaded with enough food and water for 4 days, a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, and enough supplies to keep me safe. I carried a knife, a hatchet, and a .357 revolver. I wasn't worried about people. I was worried about bears, coyotes, or anything else that might see me as food. The hike in was long and rough. I had studied maps and used my GPS to chart a route, but these trails weren't well maintained. Some parts were overgrown, and I had to push through thick brush. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I don't mean peaceful quiet. I mean the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. By the time I found a good clearing to set up camp, The sun was hanging low. The trees were tall and dense, their branches weaving together to block out the last bits of light. I cleared a patch of ground, set up my tent, and started a small fire. My body ached from the long hike, but I felt good. I was miles from civilization, alone in the wild, just how I wanted. But something felt off. As night fell, I sat by the fire eating a protein bar. The silence around me was unnatural. Usually, you hear insects buzzing, owls hooting, or maybe a distant coyote howl. But there was nothing, just the crackling of my fire. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the thickness of the forest blocking sound. Maybe I was overthinking it, but my gut was telling me something was wrong. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was close, branches snapping, the rustling of leaves. Something was moving in the dark, just outside the reach of my fire's glow. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. My hand rested on the grip of my revolver, heart pounding. Could be a deer, could be a bear, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right with me. It stopped. I stared into the dark, waiting for whatever it was to make another move. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. My breath felt too loud in my own ears. Nothing. I forced myself to relax, but I kept my gun close. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal passing through. Either way, I wasn't going to let it ruin my trip. I banked the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. Sleep didn't come easy. Every tiny noise outside made my body tense up. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the trees, the normal sounds of the forest. Then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps, not an animal, not a four-legged shuffle. These were slow, deliberate steps, human. I held my breath, gripping my revolver tight. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The steps were close, just outside my tent. Then the worst sound yet, a deep inhale. Someone was standing right outside my tent, breathing in through their nose, slow and heavy, like they were smelling the air. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump out, gun raised, and scare them off. But I didn't move. I just laid there, heart hammering, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then the steps moved away, slow, steady, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I laid there, gripping my gun, waiting for the sound to come back. But it never did. As soon as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I was up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone being there. Just the untouched forest around me. I packed up fast. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. The hike back felt longer. My nerves were shot. Every little sound made me jump. I kept my gun in my hand the entire way. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack inside, got in, and locked the doors. Only when I was back on the main road did I start to breathe easy. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't ever want to find out. It was early October, and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: a solo weekend away in the Yorkshire moors, where I could clear my head and escape from the constant noise of my life back in Manchester. The moors were vast, rugged, and quiet, the kind of place where you could walk for miles and not see another soul. I had done solo camping before, but never here. My usual spots were in the Lake District or the Peak District, where the paths were well marked, and you were never too far from some sign of civilization. But the moors were different. There were no towering mountains, just rolling, endless hills covered in thick grass and heather, stretching out in every direction. I had seen photos of the place online. Endless skies, mist rolling over the hills at dawn. It looked perfect. I packed my gear on a Friday afternoon. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a small stove, some dehydrated meals, and enough water to last me 2 days. My phone was fully charged, though I knew I wouldn't have much signal. I also brought a physical map and a compass just in case. I drove out of the city, the roads turning from motorways to smaller country lanes, until finally, I arrived at a parking area near the edge of the moors. There was no visitor center, no proper campsite, just a small gravel pull-off where a couple of other cars were parked. I assumed they belonged to hikers. I locked my car, hoisted my backpack over my shoulders, and set off. The first few hours were everything I had hoped for. The air was crisp but not too cold. The sky a dull gray that made the golden brown hills seem even more dramatic. The land stretched on forever, with hardly any trees, just open space. The path I followed was narrow and muddy in places, but easy enough to walk on. By late afternoon, I had reached a spot that seemed ideal. A flat stretch of land near a small stream, surrounded by gentle hills. There were no signs that anyone had camped there recently. No fire pits, no trash, nothing. I set up my tent quickly, rolling out my sleeping bag and checking my supplies. I had plenty of food and water, and though the wind had picked up, my tent was sturdy enough to handle it. After a quick meal, I sat outside for a while, listening to the sound of the wind rushing through the grass. The quiet was incredible. No cars, no voices, just nature. As the sun dipped below the hills, the temperature dropped. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and turned off my torch. I woke up sometime in the night, feeling uneasy. At first, I wasn't sure why. The wind had died down, and the moors were completely silent. No owls, no rustling grass, just silence. Then I heard it, a single footstep somewhere outside my tent. I held my breath. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, a slow, careful step on the damp earth. I stayed completely still, listening. Another step, then another. Someone was out there. I reached for my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I glanced at my watch, just past 2 a.m. My first thought was that maybe it was another hiker, lost and looking for help. But why would they be walking so slowly, so carefully? I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. The footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like forever, my ears straining. My tent was a lightweight one, made of thin material. If someone really wanted to get in, they could do it in seconds. I considered calling out, but something told me not to. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. The sound faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There were no footprints. The ground was damp and soft. There should have been some sign, but there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted something outside, and my half-asleep brain had turned it into footsteps. I made breakfast, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I considered packing up and heading back to my car, but I had planned for 2 nights. If I left now, it would feel like I was running away from nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination and decided to stay. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The day passed without incident. I hiked further into the moors, making sure to mark my path so I wouldn't get lost. The landscape was stunning. Huge open skies, rolling hills stretching forever. But despite the beauty, I felt uneasy. I returned to my campsite before dark, not wanting to be caught out too late. As the last light faded, I crawled into my tent, forcing myself to relax. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing, just outside my tent. It was slow and deep. Someone, or something, was standing just outside the thin layer of fabric, breathing. I lay frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The breathing stopped. Then, a single finger ran along the side of my tent. Slowly, from top to bottom, I stopped breathing. The silence stretched on. Then, just like the night before, the presence moved away. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about anything except getting back to my car. I walked fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The moors felt different now, less open, more suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the gravel pull-off. My car was there, untouched. I threw my pack in the boot, got in, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. At the edge of the moor, just before the hills swallowed the land, stood a figure. Too far to see details, but close enough that I knew it was watching me. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I told myself I wouldn't think about it, that I would forget it. But weeks later, I found myself looking up stories about the moors. Missing hikers, strange sightings, people disappearing without a trace. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I had been training with Adam for almost 2 years. We met at the gym, bonded over deadlifts and protein shakes, and somehow became close friends despite barely knowing much about each other outside of training. He was the kind of guy who never skipped leg day, always pushed himself harder than necessary, and had a quiet, disciplined nature. We didn't talk much outside of workouts, but when we did, it was mostly about training, diet, or general fitness. One day, he brought up camping. Said he needed a break from the gym, from the city. He mentioned a spot a few hours out, somewhere in the mountains, deep into the forest. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps, a little off the beaten path. He told me it was remote, quiet, the perfect place to clear the mind. I wasn't big on camping, but I liked the idea of a challenge. No distractions, no comfort, just surviving for a few days. Sounded like a good way to test myself outside of the gym. So I agreed. We packed light tents, sleeping bags, some food, and gear. No fancy equipment, no luxuries, just enough to keep us going. The drive out was long, the roads winding, the last stretch nothing but dirt and gravel. No phone signal, no signs of people. The last place we saw before turning off into the woods was an old, run-down gas station. The kind where the windows were covered in grime, the sign was half broken, and there was only one pump that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The guy behind the counter barely looked up when we grabbed a couple of bottles of water and an extra can of fuel. We drove for another hour after that, deeper into the trees until the road itself was gone, replaced by a rough, overgrown path. Adam had been here before, knew where to go, so I trusted him to lead the way. When we finally stopped, the forest was thick, the trees tall and packed close together. The air smelled damp, earthy. No sounds except the wind through the branches and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. We set up camp near a small clearing, right by a river. It was a good spot. Fresh water nearby, flat ground for the tents, and plenty of space to move around. We built a fire, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. That first night was uneventful. Cold, quiet, almost too still. I barely slept. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because something about the place felt off. Like the silence was too deep, the kind that didn't feel natural. The next morning, we went for a run, keeping up our training even out here. It was tough, the uneven ground and thick brush making every step harder. But it felt good. Afterward, we decided to hike up the ridge to get a better view of the area. That's when we noticed something strange. There were tracks. Not animal tracks, not human either. Something in between. They were deep, wide, like something heavy had passed through. The stride was long, longer than any normal step. Adam stared at them for a while, his expression unreadable. We followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the thicker part of the forest, where the trees were too close together to see much. I shrugged it off, assumed it was nothing, maybe just an animal with an odd gait. The rest of the day was normal. We trained a bit, cooked more food, talked about fitness goals. Nothing weird, but that night things changed. I woke up to a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the tents. I didn't move at first, just listened. The fire had burned down to embers, barely any light. I could hear Adam's breathing in the other tent. Slow, steady, asleep. Then something brushed against my tent. I froze. Whatever it was close. Too close. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled the tent again, then stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I lay there. heart pounding, barely breathing. Eventually, sleep took over. The next morning, Adam was already up, staring at the ground near the fire pit. The same tracks we'd seen on the ridge were there, but this time they were around our camp. Close, too close. We didn't talk about it, just packed up our gear, ate quickly, and decided to move deeper into the woods, away from whatever had been out there. Maybe it was a bad idea, but staying put didn't feel any better. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, the air heavier. And then we found something. A cabin. Old, abandoned, the wood dark with age. No windows, just empty holes where glass used to be. The door was slightly open. Adam walked up first, peering inside. I followed, hesitant. The inside was empty, just a single chair in the middle of the room. Dust-covered, untouched for years. But the floor had marks, dragged marks. Something had been pulled across the floor, deep scratches in the wood. I looked at Adam. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. We left. That night, we barely slept. We didn't make a fire, just sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the tents. Something pressed against the fabric, hard enough to push it inward. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Then it was gone, just like that. The next morning, we packed up. No words, no discussion. We just knew. The hike back was tense. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching. By the time we reached the truck, the relief was overwhelming. We threw our gear in the back, got in, and drove without looking back. The gas station was still there when we passed it, the same guy behind the counter. He glanced at us as we filled up, then at the truck. "Back from the woods?" he said, his voice flat. We nodded. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning away. We didn't ask what he said, didn't want to know. We never talked about that trip after that. Never went camping again. Some things are better left alone.